Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to 5 Considerations for Selecting a Cloud Provider in 2014, specifically Infrastructure as a Service. My name is Jeff Ralyea, and I'll be your host today. Joining me is Eric Brooks, a cloud service architect from Logicalis, a leading provider of cloud services and an expert in the field. Eric, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here.
So, just a couple housekeeping things, Eric, and then we'll jump right into it. For our audience, I just want everybody to know that this is the fourth in a 4-part series of these Google Hangouts. The other 3 can be found below the viewer that you're looking at today, and we encourage you to take a look at those other considerations for other service providers that you might be looking at. Also, right below the viewing window is an opportunity to ask a question. So if at any time you do have a question, just feel free to type it in there, and it'll actually come directly to me, and I'll be sure to be able to ask Eric. So Eric, with that, why don't we get started?
Sure, absolutely.
So, Eric, maybe before we jump into the 5 considerations, why don't we start by just kind of grounding our audience with a little bit of an understanding of when we say selecting a cloud provider, and in particular selecting an infrastructure as a service provider, what are we talking about? What is infrastructure as a service, and what kinds of offerings do providers that say they are an infrastructure as a service provider or a cloud provider, what do they mean by that? What are they offering?
Well, I think it's a really good place to start because there's been such a dramatic shift in the way that businesses look at IT spending over the last 5 or 10 years, especially as it relates to investing in on-prem, architectures and servers and network and storage and all those resources versus moving to kind of the next paradigm, which is that sort of hosted or cloud model. And specifically, infrastructure as a service, it's kind of one little bit, one corner of the kind of the whole meaning of cloud, right? Because cloud can mean platform services, it could mean infrastructure services, it could mean disaster recovery services, it could be application services, or there's so many different possible services, and from provider to provider to provider, those things might mean different things. You might have a different platform from one provider to the next, and a different infrastructure from one to the next, and so on and so forth. So really, it's such a wide range of possible services that could make up ultimately a cloud service. But specifically with infrastructure, it's really it's kind of about defining, what do you get in the context of the infrastructure itself. And so, there are a lot of different components of what an infrastructure service might be. You might have some combination of physical and virtual servers. We kind of break things down into the 3 categories of sort of servers, network, storage, right? What are the core components that make up an infrastructure service? So, from a server standpoint, you might have some combination of dedicated or virtualized servers in maybe a multi-tenant or a dedicated environment. Which is probably kind of the most common thing people think of when they think of infrastructure services. But it also has it could be different storage type services. So you might have a block-based or an object-based storage service, which could absolutely be considered infrastructure services. And then you also got the suite of network services. So those might be firewall services, or other types of security services, or connectivity services, or so. Really the infrastructure service, sort of moniker in and of itself, even can be made up of a whole host of different architectures and so on and so forth. And then you start talking about different architectures from a server standpoint. So you'll see a lot of providers that are coming around now and saying not only can you, let's say like an Amazon or other providers like that specialize mostly in the Intel chip world, you also have the the IBM Power systems and certainly Sun-based systems as well. So different chip architectures as well. So just the breadth of possibilities as it relates to what types of infrastructure services you can consume from different providers is just, it's almost endless. It would take us a couple of hours to work through them all, right?
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a great summary, and I think it really does bring to light that there's a wide range of possibility in terms of if I'm a business and I'm looking to move away from on-premise infrastructure and move it to the cloud, that really the industry has grown to a point where I really should be able to provide find a provider that can help me make that move.
Oh, for sure. And the reality is that, the traditional architectures of on-prem based are perfectly valid still, right? There are certain use cases that absolutely still belong on-premise. And so really the kind of the really the best, I think, for most companies strategic, center point, the kind of the best of both worlds is potentially ends up being more of a hybrid approach. I mean, you have maybe different use cases that require different billing models. You'll see a lot of infrastructure providers providing per minute, per hour, per day, or longer sort of term type infrastructure in a combination of dedicated and physical and virtual and all these things. So it really is a different model than the traditional model, which is you gotta go hire a guy for this and a guy for that and a guy for this, and then you got to go make a huge capital investment in infrastructure, and then you got to make sure you know how to operate it, and you got to make sure it doesn't fail, and you do all these things that ultimately represent what it takes to really operate an effective and ultimately deliver an effective infrastructure service as an IT organization to the business that you support.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to clarify, just not even clarify, but emphasize something you said, which is that hybrid model is absolutely still valid, where there's the things that really belong on premise, and then there's the things that really are real beneficial when you bring them to the cloud.
For sure. Yeah.
So, Eric, I just see a question did come in, and I think it fits here really well, which is what types of workloads are best suited for infrastructure as a service?
Well, one of the you always hear people talk about the abilities of clouds, right? The expandability, scalability, reliability, all these elasticity and all these kind of ability type words, these adjectives, and you say, well, ultimately what do those things do for my business? And ultimately then, to take that a step further, what are the things that make most sense to go in the cloud? And so, you hear kind of the most common use cases of, let's say, an Amazon cloud. A Netflix runs their streaming service, for example, out of the Amazon cloud. So you have more, like almost an omnipresent web presence. So you might have e-commerce as an example. So you might contract a global traffic management service from an Akamai, and then you might, that could be another cloud service, and ultimately you need infrastructure in different parts of the world. And so, a great example would be an application that is that needs to be potentially a lot closer to the end user than maybe just hosted out of a single corporate data center. Maybe a business has acquired a new company in a different part of the world, maybe over in Asia or something, and they need to provide their same business services to that company, and the performance associated with the proximity is critical, and such they have to, instead of going and making another large investment in infrastructure and hosting it in another part of the world, they can simply ring up an Amazon or somebody else who has that global presence, provision servers quickly, and become get online a lot faster. So that's definitely one. I think another one really that we're seeing a lot more of now is the project-based 3-month requirement for resources, where you have I have this short-term or middle-term project that I don't expect to go for forever, but I need some amount of infrastructure that's going to be associated with this project or to facilitate it, that I might not. So it really just doesn't make any sense for me to make that significant investment in that infrastructure when I essentially could throw it away, or I certainly don't know that I'll need it in 3 months or 6 months or what have you. So those are kind of those elasticity, scalability type of requirements where cloud makes a ton of sense, because infrastructure services are very expensive to build, and if you don't need them for the 3-year term that you typically would depreciate a hardware asset over, it makes a ton of sense.
All right, yeah, I think that's a great answer to that question. Eric, let's jump in. So today, the point we're going to cover is we're going to talk about 5 very specific considerations that our audience, whether they're viewing it live today or whether they're going to view it as a recording later on, we've identified 5 considerations that we think are real important that our viewers should be really considering when looking for an infrastructure as a service provider. So let's jump right into the first one, which is really, I think, everybody that would ever think about doing this, it'd be probably top of mind, which is security. And maybe you can walk us through, what are some of the considerations in security and around security that if I'm a business owner and I'm looking to take some of my infrastructure to the cloud, what should I be thinking about?
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings with customers or talked to folks about the idea of cloud, and really, given the fact that it is a dramatic shift in not only the way that we build and bill for IT services, but also where they're located, right? And that's, I mean, a simple change in proximity, right? Co-location versus on-prem really makes security a main concern, and as it should be, right? So, really, one of the things that you really need to be looking at is what are your own security practices. Let's oftentimes it's important to understand more about your own practices, your own technologies, your own procedures, and all of the things that you do on a day-to-day basis, assuming you have these things in place today, or or not, and understand how do those things translate to a provider. For example, I might have a round of patching that I do every month, and I do, malware scanning, and I have a provider, let's say, that provides me some sort of denial of service attacking prevention, and I have investments in hardware resources for firewalls, and I have, all of these investments in processes and procedures, and I need to understand how a cloud provider is going to, or an infrastructure as a service provider, is going to be able to map to those processes and those procedures. And additionally, you can't really talk about security without talking about compliance. And so, again, it's more about I need to first understand, what I do today, because the reality is like we talked about, most of these cloud providers are going to be multi-tenant providers, and so there's a real concern around whether or not there are things like proper security. We always talk about the noisy neighbor problem, where the fact of the matter is you're going to be co-located on potentially even the same hardware hosts from a compute, a storage, and a network standpoint. And so, at finding out from a provider what they've done, what safeguards they have in place from a technology standpoint, from a process standpoint, to make sure that things like, for example, your servers can't see the next guy's servers, or what happens if they are attacked, what policies and procedures do they have in place in order to address the various different problems that can arise from having what you call a higher attack surface associated with a larger environment. And then also finding out what a provider has done investment-wise from a security standpoint. And when I say that, I mean, has that provider chosen to attain their own knowledge, go out and basically contract their own software, their own hardware, their own resources from an operational standpoint, sufficient to really manage the necessity of having high levels of security in a cloud environment? Because one of the things a cloud architect or builder of clouds will tell you is that one of the biggest problems is multi-tenancy, and making sure with absolute certainty that no customers are able to basically see each other, interact with each other, or anything like that. And so has that company chosen to, for example, contract with an outside provider? Because I think you'll see a lot of infrastructure companies these days, not necessarily specializing in the technology associated with providing high levels of security. That's a very specialized business. And so, it actually may be a better thing if a provider has chosen, let's say, to contract out with a best-in-breed technology security provider, so that they, for example, monitor their firewalls and monitor their infrastructure, and even audit their practices and do all these things that are associated with really being operating an effective security model in a cloud environment, in that shared multi-tenant environment.
I think that makes great sense, and I think, Eric, you really touched on two different things that I think are important for our audience. The first is that it's if you have your own infrastructure today on premise, you have your own security and you have your own security policies and practices, and just because you're moving into cloud, those don't go away, right? The provider needs to be able to demonstrate that they can support what you're already doing. But then you brought up, I think, a really important point, which is how do they secure me in that co-location model? How can I be confident that what's mine is mine, and I'm never going to have to know, or I know that I'm never sharing anything that's mine and nobody can have access to it? So I think those are two really, really critical points and two great takeaways for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of those things. Security is one of those things that has to be addressed at every level. We talk about process and we talk about technology, and each one of those things has to really be effectively broken down into its core components. We talked earlier about how we kind of define everything in the context of servers, network, storage, and so addressing each of those things, whether they be the customer or the provider, as an example, is using a container-based hypervisor. And you have to assess whether or not that particular architecture really meets as a customer, your security requirements. Or, for example, do you need a fully virtualized hypervisor for shared multi-tenant resources? Or does the provider have networking technologies like network segmentation for routing and switching and firewalls that are dedicated to a customer or shared, or do those things impact, and ultimately they will, the level of security and ultimately, the acceptability from a security standpoint of what a provider is going to deliver to a customer.
I think that makes perfect sense. Eric, you mentioned it, and I think you said you really can't talk about one without talking about the other, and that's the second point that I wanted to bring up that I think is paramount here is around compliance. And there are a lot of industries that have very heavy compliance requirements. Just a couple that come to mind. Healthcare, banking, pharmaceutical companies, and so. Help the audience, get an understanding of when we talk about compliance and moving from on-premise to cloud. What should I be asking my potential providers in terms of how they can help me with those compliance issues that I face?
Yeah, and I think it's really a critical factor in the choosing of a provider, not only for compliance, but just in general for process. And that is, when people look at any provider and they say, well, I'm a healthcare company and I store, health information or patient records or something to that effect, then you need to make sure that I'm HIPAA compliant, right? Well, the reality is that when you talk about moving to a hosted or infrastructure as a service model, what you're effectively doing is you're taking the responsibility which you had, let's say yesterday you had an on-prem solution and today you're looking to move to an infrastructure as a service provider. You're taking that controlled everything from the key to the lock to the data center to the acquisition of ultimately the disposal of those resources, and you took that from partially or completely your own and kind of split it up. So now it's critical that any customer that has those types of requirements, and really any customer in general, is to really work hard to, when you go through and you decide which provider you're going to choose, they kind of say, well, you see this all the time where you'll say, well, are you HIPAA compliant? Yes, okay, that's okay. And the reality is that it's important, or it's critical for a customer to sit down with that provider and understand exactly, who does what, right? Which regulatory requirements are you going to address, and what subpoints of those, from an auditing, from a technology, from an architecture, from a process standpoint. I mean, if you're talking about HIPAA or PCI DSS, or what level. SSAE 16 is another one. FedRAMP is one you're hearing about a lot now, and so there are just so many different ones. So just going through a checklist and checking off whether or not a provider is or isn't compliant with whatever particular regulation or standard you need it's not enough. And I think really what you're starting to see too here is a lot of providers pop up with vertical specific knowledge. So a provider that might host SAP, or might host a particular healthcare application, or might host a particular type of application. And it's because A, they have infrastructure knowledge, but B, they might have, or ideally would have, specific expert knowledge in that, whatever that vertical happens to be. And I think that's, if you're in that place where you have those things, those regulatory or compliance requirements, it'd be really good to inquire with a particular provider, whomever you choose, whether or not they really do have that industry-specific or application-specific knowledge. And then also, you got to kind of be careful, right? If you ask somebody, have you done this before, and there's a hesitation to say, well, maybe yes, we can figure it out. What you really want to do is move on, because the fact of the matter is these compliance needs and requirements are oftentimes very complicated. And so, if you're talking to a provider that can't absolutely provide you the right information, the right documentation, that kind of feel good that they've done it 100 times and they know how to do it with exactly the type of application environment, whatever you need, then maybe it's time to look somewhere else. And I mean, even things like providing auditing partnerships or examples of previous audits that they've passed, or potential gotchas, issues, those types of things. Those are all going to give you a more of an assurance that that provider can do basically the things that they say they can do. And then finally, it's about flexibility. Because as things change over time, a provider that may be compliant with a particular standard today, as new standards come about, as things change, as they always do, it's important for that provider to be able to change with those standards over time and understand as those things change, to basically give the ability to ensure that that customer is and remains.
Okay. So, Eric, I think if we take security, we take compliance. One of the things that I think all of that kind of rolls itself up into, at least for me conceptually, is the notion of a service level agreement. And maybe we can help our audience. I think people maybe conceptually understand, or they've heard the term service level agreement, but in terms of moving my infrastructure out to the cloud, what are some of the specific things that I really should be looking for or asking about in terms of getting a good service level agreement?
Well, we talked a little bit about being, a little introspective initially as in the context of security, and I think, that absolutely pertains again to service level agreements. Really determining first what your business requires from a service level, and that may be specific to availability, it may be specific to security, it may be specific to some sort of process management, ITSM type services. Whether it's even strategic consulting services to develop the cloud strategy in the first place, right? So it's what types of levels of service, and that really could be anything, does your business require? And then it's about engaging and kind of trying to match those requirements up to a service provider. And then the fact of the matter is, service levels agreements are often written in a very intricate fashion in very specific language for a very specific reason, and that is to essentially to prevent the provider from having to potentially pay out oftentimes in a situation where there's a problem. And while that's certainly done for a reason, and it's not a bad thing, it does mean that you got to read the fine print. I think it's paying attention to those kinds of things and not just accepting what the provider says as the absolute and unquestionable truth. I think it's just on a responsible business owner and a responsible consumer to do that. And then I mentioned it's not just about availability in general, right? You may have different SLAs for different types of hardware, different types of service, different tiers of service, and this might be related to performance as well. A lot of times you'll see now providers are popping up, and we talked about verticals before, as hosting. They talk about big data, and big data is a nice buzzword that basically means analytics and high-speed infrastructure. Well, from an infrastructure as a service standpoint, that's great. That's fantastic. A great use of a cloud service would be analytics and data modeling, let's say. Well, the fact of the matter, though, is if you don't have an SLA around, let's say, performance of a storage solution or a network solution or what have you, then you may not be able to get the right consumption of that service, or you might not actually be able to utilize the service for the purpose that you need, or it might not be fast enough, or it might not be highly available enough. I mean, there are a lot of providers now that are starting to use, let's say, local storage and servers to keep costs down, and those all have impacts to service level agreements. And so, what are the different intricate details of those SLAs, and do those really match up with what I require for my application, for my environment, for my use case, what have you? And then, largely it's what about maintenance practices? What types of processes and procedures from a management and a maintenance standpoint does that provider have in place? And do those SLAs, are they impacted by that? Because, just because an SLA says 100% availability, the asterisk down at the bottom might say, except for emergency maintenance. Okay, well, that doesn't really make any sense, right? And while I'm not saying everybody says that, what I am saying is it's important to consider the idea of maintenance and the notion of those types of things that will need to happen in any infrastructure and how that impacts SLAs. And then finally, what if there is a problem, because failures do happen, they happen everywhere, there's no way to avoid them, is there a payout, right? Is that something that you are going to get paid back for existing investments toward, oftentimes it's toward future services. And then oftentimes a provider might even say, you have to tell us, and then we'll decide whether or not it was an outage. So it's really a lot of do your due diligence and really make sure that the fine print matches up with the service you require. Absolutely, and those things are not typically held in any kind of secrecy. They're very much oftentimes open. But it does take an inquiring mind, let's say, to make sure that those things really do match up.
I think that's a great point in terms of when I think of service level agreement, and you already mentioned it, well, it's all about uptime and availability, and as long as it's available. But I think the point that you raised, which is really important for our audience, is it's about the services that you're going to consume from this provider. And they should have an agreement for you for all of those types of services. It's not just about availability. It's about what you've asked them for, and can they, put something together, from an agreement perspective, with a little bit of a penalty in there if they don't deliver about any of the services that you're asking for.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a good thing to point out that when you talk about service level agreements, things even like responses to trouble tickets could be in there, right? It's not an acceptable response to a trouble ticket isn't the email that says we got your trouble ticket. I mean that's a very common common notion, and I think service level agreements also get into the level of service you get in a holistic sense. So are you just another number in hundreds of thousands or millions of people, or do you have that white glove type service where you're not just another number and it takes 2 and 3 weeks to get a call back, let's say. And I think that's another, while you don't necessarily write that down in a paper, I think it's important to assess the level of service you need from a provider based on whatever your business requirements are. Are you, for example, looking for large outsourcing and thus you need much more service than you might need if you were just, let's say, asking for a server to put a web server on?
That makes perfect sense, and and I think that's a great segue. I think all of this is a good segue to really the fourth consideration. The fourth consideration that that we want to discuss today really has to do with the last point that you were talking about, which is alignment of the business needs. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about, as I'm talking to providers, how do I help ensure that what I'm asking for, what my business needs are, they're going to be able to meet? What kinds of questions should I be asking, or at least what should I be thinking about?
Well, I think the core question is infrastructure as a service enough, right? Is you giving me a server in a data center in the U.S. or in Europe or Asia or wherever it is that enough? And I think for most businesses, the answer to that question is going to be absolutely no, right? I need other services. I may need a disaster recovery service, or I might need a backup service, or I might need business and strategic consulting services so I can develop my coherent and good strategy internally before I just go start throwing servers out in the cloud and hoping for the best, right? And so I think it's really about looking for a provider that not only provides infrastructure service, because that's the core of what we're talking about, but has a full suite of services. And really it gets to also to looking at more core in depth of what do you need from this provider? How does this provider align to your business? I mentioned outsourcing. If you're looking for a larger move to a provider for the purpose, let's say, of outsourcing, is do you need monitoring? Do you need management? Are you requiring other functions that you might not necessarily get with just a core infrastructure service? Because just because you have a server doesn't necessarily mean it's backed up, or it doesn't necessarily mean if the provider data center fails that you're going to have a good disaster recovery strategy, because just as with on-prem solutions, cloud solutions fail as well. So, what are those? What's that provider going to provide you for those additional services that I think really make up a true cloud service? And then also, does that provider have specific knowledge and expertise in whatever business you're in? If you're in a particular vertical, healthcare, retail, e-commerce, or manufacturing, or transportation, or there are an endless number of verticals that could potentially require very specific knowledge. Does that provider have the ability to align and be flexible enough to deliver you a cloud service that fits for your business? And that's really gets into a service is not it's the same service does not function for everyone. There has to be a sense of flexibility, a sense of customizability, right? And so, finding a provider, asking a provider, what can they do? For example, what can you do if my business grows or doesn't, right? How do your billing terms, how does your architectures, how do your technologies and your plan align with my business plan, right? How do those things match up? And if I think that if you don't explore that, you kind of miss out on the whole picture. Where if you just look at give me a server, then you kind of miss the point of cloud services. It's the idea of cloud is supposed to be to we always say servicize, or really kind of standardize and turn IT into a real consumable service versus just infrastructure, because there's so much more to the picture than that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in that, and you mentioned it a couple times, which is, just go get me a server. You said that, this server needed to be upgraded and it was on premise. Well, can't you just go get me one of those cloud servers, because, I don't have to buy it and depreciate it. I can just expense it. But it's really a lot. There's a lot more than that, because it's well, why? What do you need the server for? What is it going to be used? How does that lead me into the discussion around the other services that I might need, backup, disaster recovery? Because if I'm putting a mission critical application on this server that I've just gone to the cloud, and the provider doesn't talk to me about any of those things, I could be setting myself up for a pretty bad situation.
Absolutely, and I mean, just because you can provision a server in a cloud somewhere through a self-service portal, which is something that everybody should be looking for, kind of as a basic tenet of any provider, but it doesn't necessarily mean that is your business moving to the cloud. Oftentimes, one of the hardest things about moving to any cloud or infrastructure service is migration. Getting large amounts of data that most enterprises have accumulated over some number of years is a huge challenge, right? Because and really, when we talk about cloud, the two biggest challenges are going to be multi-tenancy and connectivity. And so, even working with a business to determine the impact to, for example, software licensing is something that, I just about didn't have any idea what the impact to their software licensing with, let's say, a company like Microsoft would be if they moved to the cloud. And I can tell you from experience that that's an incredibly complex process that, if you don't partner with a provider that understands that's done that before, that can speak in simple terms to explain it, that can be an extremely complex and potentially risky process, because, the thing you don't want to do is end up going to a provider and either A, you're basically consuming a service that you don't necessarily understand and isn't explained to you, or B, be in a situation where you're out of compliance with whatever software agreements you have in place. And that's a serious risk for a lot of businesses that they probably don't necessarily understand as a component to moving to an infrastructure service.
That makes sense. Yeah, we got two questions here. One I'm going to take, which is, will this session be available for rebroadcast? And absolutely it will. And if when you submit the question, you do submit your email address, we'll go ahead and send you a direct link to the playback itself, so that it'll be really easy to find. It'll be found in your email inbox. And then, Eric, this one's for you, which is, does the physical location of the infrastructure as a service data center make a difference?
It does. It absolutely does, and it does for a lot of different perspectives. And I should sort of start this out by saying, I could have started out this by saying, no, it doesn't matter, right? So there are arguments to be made both ways. The way I would say it is, it absolutely does matter. Some applications, maybe you're delivering desktops, or maybe you're delivering some sort of web application or something to that effect to an end user that might even be within the United States, but all the way across the country, or maybe in Alaska or Hawaii, and they have some fairly significant, latency impact to the experience of that user consuming whatever service that is. Like I said, if it's a desktop or web application, or even just email, right? And so, it's really critical for a lot of applications to be able to be in proximity to the user in order to deliver from a location standpoint, technologically, absolutely. And I think location also has to do with other factors, like we talked about disaster recovery. Sticking a data center right on the southern tip of Florida might not necessarily be the best place for a data center, or certainly if you do have one, you better have one sitting in Nevada too, with a cohesive or a comprehensive disaster recovery plan. So absolutely location matters. Another reason location would matter is, for example, if let's say I have a customer who's in Germany, and laws in Germany are very specific, which say you cannot take data outside of Germany for German businesses. It just doesn't work that way. You cannot do it. It's absolutely forbidden. And so if I'm trying to service customers in different regions, in different countries, in different parts of the world, location absolutely does matter. But then again, if your applications are tolerant of these types of things, if you have, maybe you use other services to manage different parts of your application or the service you're delivering, then it absolutely may not matter. So it really comes down to the case-by-case basis. But I would say more often than not, absolutely.
That makes perfect sense. So Eric, we've got some time left, and I think it's important to get to this last consideration, which is one that I think there's always going to be risk associated in a business, whether I stay on premise, whether I go to the cloud. But I think there are probably some very specific risk considerations associated with moving from on-premise to the cloud in terms of infrastructure and other services. Help us get a sense of what I should be thinking about in terms of risk, risk management, risk assessment.
Yeah, so really it kind of gets to everything, and this is a sort of a nice way to kind of round out the fifth point, and because really, if you look at the previous 4 points we've discussed, ultimately there's some component of risk or risk aversion that is a component of them, right? Some part of those things really does get to managing risk. So one of the big things that we talk about is from a risk standpoint is what's the risk of or not moving to the cloud, and so one of the kind of the big drivers is will I lose agility in my business by moving to a hosted infrastructure, or will I gain it, right? What am I going to get out of that? And ultimately, for example, if I'm running a project that's going to last for 3 to 6 months, what's the risk to the business of it taking a month or two of that 3 months to get the infrastructure in place to actually execute that project? What's the risk to the business to delaying those types of things, or basically putting the additional strain on resources in order to do that? So there's kind of that business process and sort of more business focused risk, and then there's we talked about security, which is a huge risk assessment component from both a technology and a process standpoint. We talked about disaster recovery. That's a huge potential risk, and then also really it's is that provider going to consult with me to understand what my risk factors are, and what are the ones that I don't necessarily know about yet, and how am I going to assess those in moving to a cloud service? Because quite frankly, every business is different, and so if you don't go with a provider that's going to be able to sit down with you and provide that real expert level knowledge, I would be willing to bet that most may not actually understand completely what those risks are in moving to or not a cloud service provider of any kind.
I think that's a great point. One of the things that and you've mentioned it a couple times, but I think in this particular one, it really comes to light for me, which is if the provider's willing to sit down with me and really have that strategic discussion around this is my business, these are the business needs that I have that I want to move to the cloud, and in the discussion of how and when we could do that, they're not just talking about what it would cost or the physical mechanics of what needs to be done, but they're walking me through the security aspects. They're walking me through how they can help with compliance, as you said, so that I can do all of my assessment. But then they're actually sitting down and having an upfront, honest discussion with me about, hey, here are the risk elements that you need to be considering.
Well, for sure, and that's all part of making any large shift in any way of doing business, is assessing really what those risks are, because as you move out of your on-prem solution into a hosted or an infrastructure as a service solution, you're potentially opening yourself up to a heck of a lot different challenges and ultimately risks than you would today, and coming up or working with or partnering with a provider that can coherently and completely articulate what those are, and also conveniently what they've done to mitigate those risks to the extent that it's possible within the cost confines of delivering an effective and market competitive service. then I think that's really where you want to be if you're really looking for a true enterprise class or enterprise grade cloud service.
Makes great sense. Yeah, Eric Brooks, Cloud Service Architect with Logicalis, here with me. We were discussing the 5 considerations for selecting a cloud provider in 2014. Again, this session has been recorded. It will be available for playback, as are the other 3. This was the 4th in a 4-part series. So we hope you enjoyed this show, and we hope you get an opportunity to take a look at the other 3. Eric Brooks, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right. Appreciate it, everybody. Have a great day.